lasers. I think I'm at a funeral. All right, hey folks, it's March the 3rd, and March the 1st for adult credit class 1301, and we are going to pick up where we left off on the age of the Early Republic. And so we were talking about things like some of the presidents that President Washington set in the nation, such as cabinet positions, putting down rebellions. And we left off talking about Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, who reformed to help out American business, commerce, coinage, bank, the National Bank, and stuff like that. So these are big problems. There's a lot of things to hammer out. It's easier to have a revolution than it is to make something. It's easier to destroy. Like burning a house down is a lot easier than building a house. It's the same with a nation or government. And this one had to be built. So, where was this? I don't remember. But so I mean, like things were definitely different back then. The shape and the face of cities, as we've seen last semester, changed a lot with modern plumbing, electricity, transportation, cars, and stuff like that. Back then, roads and towns were made for the idea of walking in buggies. So economy continued, protective tariffs. So remember, we talked about a tariff is essentially when the founders created the country, for the most part, they were hoping that the way to pay for the national government was through tariffs, that they didn't need much money, just enough to keep some soldiers, some Navy, a few office officials, and keep the mail running. That's pretty much it. Otherwise, they didn't think they need that much money. It's frozen. 1 second. There it goes. It unfrozen. All right, so what were they? Taxes on imported goods, like we said. Why? To protect domestic manufacturing from foreign manufacturers to produce the same product at cheaper prices. Now, the reason I have this definition up here like this is because tariffs were a really important thing to people back then. People don't think too much about tariffs today. Even when, let's say, over the past 10 years, there have been a lot of tariffs that have been put in place that affect things that you buy. You just don't think about them, right? So they're always protected, though. They're always protected, at least in their intention. And they do protect certain industries. They really do. But the cost is always past the consumer. Because even though you're taxing this product as it comes into your country, the person selling it will only up the price so that you pay that tax. So who enjoys tariffs throughout much of American history at this time, all the way through and up to the Civil War? Well, it was the North. It was the North because that's where we already had, as we've seen, some of the growing industries in the 13 colonies. And that's definitely going to continue as America becomes more and more industrialized up to and through the Civil War. The South does not care so much for these. Farmers don't really produce a lot of modern things. Of course, they grow things from the earth or from plants and animals, and they do some processing of them. But for the most part, the money they make, they want to go towards the cheapest product. And the cheapest product could be something made in another country. They don't care. But they have money. They don't want necessarily their money to have to go as a form of corporate welfare. Yeah, go ahead. To pay higher cost for a plow made in Pennsylvania when they could have got a cheaper one shipped in from England, right? So the bottom line, consumers, you and I, hate tariffs when they drive up costs. Producers, manufacturers, and the industry workers love these since they increase local business. And that's true. And it's still true today. So if you're somebody who makes cardboard, you want to stop foreign nations from selling cardboard here because that's competition. Competition drives down prices. That decreases your profits. and it could affect your pay, or it could even affect your job, like your ability to have one. If you can't sell your commodities, you can't keep your business. I mean, there's a lot of people facing that right now, but like restaurants and stuff like that in some places, they can't seem to open up their business under certain models right now. So they go under. So, of course, I think as far as profit margin goes, restaurants are the second least profitable business, construction being the first. And so, but because of that, they're also like the most unstable. They're the easiest to if something goes wrong, goes under. So, let's go to the next one. All right. So, here we see Alexander Hamilton, and who's this guy?
James Madison.
Yeah, James Madison. So, like I told you, this is where we're going to see, it's under the Washington administration, it's when we're going to see the birth of the political parties. Though he's not going to put up with it while he's in office. As soon as he leaves, these differing views will lead to our first political parties. All right, so January 1790, Hamilton submitted his report on public credit. Remember, he's Secretary of Treasury. He was asked to investigate what needs to be done about our nation's economy. He made the following main points when he presented this. 1, you need to handle foreign debts. 2, state debts. And 3, national debts. Regarding national debts, Hamilton wanted to pay back old promissory notes, paper continentals, to whomever had them. So what's the deal with this? Remember I told you that the soldiers fighting in the American Revolution got paid in IOUs? Well, that's these paper continentals, right? Promissory notes. Well, a lot of these soldiers were hungry, and they weren't being supplied with food or like shoes and stuff like that. Remember those horrible winters like at Valley Forge we were talking about? So they would trade these with merchants. They'd be like, hey, I'll give you this piece of paper the government said they'll give me $1,000 for if you'll give me $10 worth of food. And you trade it because you're desperate and you're not really sure if you're going to win or get the money back anyways. And so Hamilton was like, hey, whoever has these things, we'll just give them the money, no questions asked. So some merchants might have accumulated hundreds of these things. And they're like, wow, I can trade these in for real money with our new government. Madison thought that was totally corrupt. He's like, no. They scammed our soldiers. So let's just pay the patriots and not the people who hold them, which is kind of hard though, because they didn't have very good records on who did what, And so he thought that speculators helped them, come on, somebody who, I think about like a Wall Street investor, right? Like a day trade, buy high, or you buy low and you sell high. So he was like, no, this is corrupt. We can't do that. And so this is going to make a division between the two. So, and they both have a moral point. One is, hey, they made an agreement. We pay them this. The other is, well, this person fought for us and we made a promise to them. Let's keep our promise. So it's kind of tricky. All right. However, the only way Hamilton convinced the South to pay state debts was due to a secret deal that he made with Madison and Jefferson to move the capital to Washington, closer to the South. So the idea was wherever the nation's capital resided, that region would have the most influence over the federal government. And so that's why Washington, D.C. was picked just on the northern tip of Virginia. And Virginia, remember, was like the focal point of the South. It's where a lot of these guys were from, like Jefferson and Madison, Washington, guys like that. So Hamilton very cleverly was able to them off with this promise in order to get them to come on his side. So pay state debts. So this was to help convince the South that the federal government should pay for the state debts for states that spent a whole lot of money during the American Revolution. Remember I told you, some states would pay off their debts to foreign nations and banks. Some weren't. And the ones that paid it off didn't think it was fair. They'd have to pay for another state's debt. So Hamilton was like, hey, here, take this and stop talking. All right, so other part, national bank. This is our first national bank building. There you go down. Okay, so later in 1791, Hamilton wished to create a national bank. We talked about that last week. National banks are important. They can help stabilize currency. They can help regulate banks and set interest rates and things like that. And it looks good to foreign nations and investors. It's going to be modeled in the Bank of England. Remember, Hamilton loved the idea of making America a little England. Economically. Of course, he did like the idea of a strong central government as well. This was to begin practices such as manipulation of the interest rates and subsidies for American companies. So subsidies is like, you can have like direct subsidies where like, hey, here's some cash to you company for helping make something our nation thinks we need. Like, I don't know, cannons. You make cannons and our military needs cannons. So we're going to give you some money to help you build those cannons. Or tax breaks and stuff like that later on, right? So, but once again, another division. We have the northern ideas of Hamilton and the southern ideas of Madison and Jefferson. Madison, and are also kind of western ideas too. Madison and Jefferson opposed because the government had neither the implied nor the expressed right to do so through the Constitution. Remember, they are constructionist, literalist. They interpret the Constitution. If it says you can do it, you can, but if it doesn't say it, you better stay out of it. Hamilton argued that it was possible due to Article 1, Section 8, that Congress had the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. He's like, see, that's my blank check. The feds can do whatever we want to because we can deem what is necessary and proper. So, could be good, could be bad. But yeah, this is going to be a big contentious issue in American politics from here on out because farmers are never going to trust national banks. And they're going to see the national bank as essentially the holders of gold. And gold-backed currency is going to be seen as like the money of bank manipulation. And then instead, farmers are going to want silver throughout much of American history. And to get rid of big banks, and some want to get rid of almost all banks in general, because they're going to see them as people who give you loans, and when you're down on your luck, they foreclose on your farm, and you're impoverished the rest of your life. So,
which is unfortunate.
It is unfortunate, and it's really hard too. Once the economy gets more complicated, you can't keep up with the markets, or you might focus and specialize in a method, not a method, but a product that's going to get washed out in the market. Like once you start doing that, and it's like, well, you can't do the same thing forever and expect the same result. And that goes for economies too. We think about English history. You had the Luddites, where you had these guys who were like textile weavers, and they made a really good living making cloth. But once you had steam-powered, or I think they're steam-powered weaving machines that started to replace them, well, guess what? They couldn't make a lot of money anymore. The competition blew them out. That's what some people are afraid of with automated workforce, like robots and stuff like that. I remember hearing about that since I was a kid. I grew up around a lot of factory workers, and they were scared of robots taking their jobs. But that's why you got to make sure you're on your toes so you can change into something else. It was something like, I remember hearing about a study in South Korea. South Korea said that in this study, they're so what's the word I'm looking for? I forgot who the study was by, but it was really interesting. They're expecting so much automation and artificial intelligence to get so integrated into their economy that even half the doctors and professors and people like that may start having their jobs obsolete within the next 10 years or so.
What else are we gonna do? Just sit at home and do nothing?
I don't know.
We're gonna
Like,
have so much healthcare.
yeah, what can you do whenever you just really can't do something that's economically viable? Like most people couldn't. I really don't know. Like I don't know. Because usually you just think of menial tasks, right? Like maybe tightening screws on an assembly line, or maybe even like cleaning streets or something like that. Making burgers, that kind of stuff could be automated. But to think about intellectual jobs too, it could happen. I mean, there's like a million lectures out there on like introduction to variables for like introduction to algebra, but there's only a few that are really, really good. So do you really need all those others?
No.
No, you probably don't, which means there's a lot of people who teach algebra 1 who might not, or pre-algebra, that might not be the most important jobs in the world anymore. So kind of scary stuff. Make sure you're useful.
Too underestimated.
Well, I don't know. I could definitely see certain things like teachers becoming obsolete, especially once you really want to standardize stuff, right? If you're like, look, there's a lot of teachers like Mr. Weidner who talk about some things in the history we don't really care about, don't matter. So if we just had a really good program that could just get to the points that need to be done and not worry about the other stuff, you don't need people like Mr. Weidner. Right?
Programs can't answer questions.
They're getting
Actually,
better.
they
They're
can.
getting better.
Well, they
They're getting
can't
real better.
in depth explain it to you because they don't know you as well as the person.
That's true. In Japan right now, because of skyrocketing depression they've had in the past year, their government's pushing to provide more access to some kind of like virtual counselor you like talk to, and it talks back to you and answers questions and stuff like that.
That's nice.
So, yeah, it's like it's kind of morbid when you think about it, but it's like we're getting better, but there's something like kind of off about it too. So
That's called uncanny valley.
don't worry, it'll talk back to you. Oh yeah, guess what? Remember I told you how England got in super bad debt from the French and Indian War, and that debt kind of led to a domino effect all the way leading up to our American Revolution. Well, our American Revolution did the same thing to France. France got involved in a war with us, or I'm sorry, in our revolution. They helped us. And they spent a lot of money fighting England during and after that. It is going to make a massive amount of debt, just like England had after the French and Indian War. And so what happens? The king has to address this debt. And so he calls for the Estates General. That's like their parliament for the first time in a very long time. And he requests taxes. And he already had been really pushing taxation. Well, that's going to lead to resentment, and it's going to lead to the overthrow of the government and a revolution in their part. But theirs is going to be super, super radical. Whereas our revolution, you could say, was based on the ideas of John Locke. Their revolution was based more on the idea of Robespierre. Not Robespierre. I mean, that was one of the leaders of Robespierre, but Rousseau. And so the idea of us was going back to that old English common law, personal liberty, and the value of property, but tied to God. Whereas with Rousseau, the ideas were more about getting back to like in nature in many ways, like a mythical kind of nature, based on the ideas of a new science that they didn't fully understand, and breaking away from all old institutions, including their king, their religion, and all these other things. And it's going to be chaos, complete chaos. And of course, the guillotine. Yeah, if we had time like French Revolution, man, it is like interesting and horrid. And it's a good, huh?
I watched like a 4-part series.
Very good. And it goes to show that the French Revolution is a good example, one of the many historical examples, that whenever you have hyper, super crazy democracy, it always somehow has a vacuum effect that leads back to dictatorship. It happens all the time.
And it also leads to a bunch of people dying almost every time.
Oh yeah. Lots and lots. So, foreign affairs. In 1789, the people of France rebelled against Louis XVI after he sought to raise taxes during a period of economic hardship. There was especially he was trying to raise a salt tax. I think it's called the Gabal or something like that. I probably said it wrong. And already in France, they had massive taxation on their people. In fact, the inequality of wealth in France was like mind-blowing. There were some communities in France, a royal official found, where the people were so poor and isolated, they were still living in the Middle Ages, and they would go through periods of famine, where sometimes the young and the old would starve to death, where not a person in town was literate. So France, however, you go to the capital and you'd have the Louvre, and you would just have the Queen Marie Antoinette. She had her own private zoo, and they had all these magnificent opera houses gilded in gold and marble statues, and just extreme lavish. Louis XVI, I think it was his father or his grandfather, was very good too about one of the ways he ensured political power was he took all the nobility and he basically moved them all into his palace, and he would wine and dine and party them and entertain them every day. And by doing so, they did whatever he wanted, but it was super expensive. And in France, if you were a noble, you didn't have to pay taxes. So most of the people who owned most of the money didn't have to pay taxes and help the system. It pretty much just fell on the shoulders of the peasantry. Americans initially supported the revolutionaries. It sounded great at first. And at first, the revolution was actually held by like-minded individuals like the American Revolution. They had something called the Tennis Court Oath, where you essentially had these people who were really moved by ideas of the Enlightenment to make a new government, a constitutional monarch, where the king would still be king, but they would have a separation of powers, kind of like in England and America, where you would have a court, where you would have a legislature and an executive being the king. It didn't quite work out that way. The king was not very happy with that idea, though he was placed under house arrest. But then the radicals would take over, led by the guy I told you called Robespierre. These are called Jacobins. It's like an underground political network. And they called for liberty, equality, and fraternity until the horrors of the Reign of Terror came to light. And that's what the Jacobins called it, the Reign of Terror. The idea was to use politically motivated violence, getting rid of all dissenters, anyone who thought twice about the revolution. You killed them, and you took their stuff, and then you gave it to the people, right? But it was super corrupt, as we'll see later. France now was scaring the entire world. They killed their king, and they went into this crazy, chaotic government that's frightened the world. They banned all religion. They tried to change their names, the way they see the days and months, things like that, all to pull itself away from Christianity. They also were making these little, I guess you call them spy groups, that would go into other countries and try to make new revolutions. And so this was really scaring the monarchies throughout the other parts of Europe. And so England, Spain, Austria, Prussia, which was, Germany, declared war on France. France was now in a world war against all of their neighbors. They called in America to aid them, but we were like, no, thank you. So some Americans supported going to war, while others wished to stay out of it. Jefferson really supported, for the most part, the French Revolution until really crazy stories came back home. Hamilton was really blown back. Hamilton supported anything that England supported. That he didn't like the idea of all this crazy revolution talk anyways. So this is going to divide Americans. But most Americans were very conservative religious people. And once they started learning about a lot of the stories that were coming back from the French Revolution, you're not going to have a lot of American support for it. Not so much at all.
Why was France going against Christianity?
Well, for one thing, is like they had a lot of resentment against, like say the church, right? Because they saw a lot of the church holdings in France is holding a lot of money and wealth and power and stuff like that. But one of the things that came out of the French Enlightenment, they called it the Age of Reason, right? And so they believed that a lot of the things in their view in Christianity didn't make sense at a logical level. And they thought that it was, and during this time period, you had pre-Darwinist evolutionary movement. You also had, like, atheism was seen as like the intellectual superiority of the day to them. So they thought if you're religious, then you're obedient mentally, and they looked down on that. So they thought they were being kind of like as far as like, I don't know, it was a big belief in like you can only believe in what you see, like empirical. Like that's the way to put it. So, but as far as like why, I don't know. See, that's the thing. During the time of the revolution, it wasn't like really a super intellectual movement. It just started moving into like anarchy, just destroying everything. And what's funny is like the guys who led the revolution, the Jacobins, they started to see religion as a tool. So they actually made a cult for themselves with like their own bust and stuff like that, and holidays for themselves. So they actually made themselves into like deified themselves. They made themselves into idols, kind of like the old Roman emperors and stuff like that. And they tried to make something they called the cult of reason, to where you would basically kind of worship human intellectualism in a way. It was just, it's really just like raining cats and dogs. Oh yeah. So foreign affairs continued. So France sent a diplomat to America called Citizen Edmund Guinée. And Edmund immediately started to recruit Americans to go to France in order to fight for their cause. In Philadelphia, he even had a captured British ship converted into a privateer. So he was, without American permission, came to America, asked for our help. We're like, whoa, we can't do that. That's crazy. We're not going to war against England yet. Remember? Washington was like, let's stay out of everybody else's business. And so what does he do? Fine. He starts collecting up people who volunteer and starts trying to make them into pirates. So Washington was infuriated. In April 22nd, 1793, Washington declared neutrality in the war and gave this guy the boot. Jefferson felt we owed France enormous moral debt for their aid in the revolution. In protest, he resigned from Washington's cabinet. He didn't think we should quite go that far and treat them that way. Of course, he could make the argument that this wasn't the same France that helped us. But this affair only deepened the factious element in America. Yeah.
Okay, so this is in the midst of the Reign of Terror.
Yeah. So
They could definitely argue that point that France is running around just because we watched the video of it. I'm pretty sure in here, and Robespierre got to the point where, like, if you even hesitated or said something you didn't like,
Yes.
he'd be like, chop your head off.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to see similar mimicries of this later on. This is going to be studied especially by Marxist revolutionaries later. It has been said by quite a few historians that the French Revolution is the first Marxist revolution. And reigns of terror and getting rid of any dissent, making examples. Mao did the same thing. Lenin did the same thing. The same thing happened in Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba. If you have a history of being on the other side, the ones who are the strongest on the other side go first. And you tell the others, it's okay, we're not coming after you. And then you eventually start going for more and more. And by doing so, you make sure that everybody stays in line. It's control through fear. It's control through fear. And it works for a little while. It might work for a whole generation. It might work for more.
Until they just put Robespierre on the chopping block.
And they did. Yeah, and they weren't expecting it either. Him and his friends were like having lunch or something like that. Two of them tried to shoot themselves in the head. One accidentally shot his own face off, but he lived. One jumped out of the window and broke his leg. They wound up all getting caught. And despite all of the people they had beheaded, they protested and cried and wailed all the way up to the gallows. So they weren't exactly like noble people for their cause in any case, I would guess.
No.
And, yeah, they were really hard against Christianity. There were some villages out in the French provinces that would try to fight back, but they would bring the whole army against them, and they had something they called what do they call them? They call them like marriages of the something like marriages of the revolution or something like that. And so what they would do is they would just tie a whole bunch of men and women together and put them on boats, and then they'd sink the boats. They just came up with all kinds of like weird ways to execute people.
Why would you do that?
Because they just wanted to. I think it just goes to show they were actually having fun murdering people. I think it just goes to show how twisted it all got. I mean, look. I mean, it's amazing how monstrous people get when they start systematically killing people. You look at Auschwitz on the gate to enter and exit. To enter, it said, what was it? It was like work will set you free. Some people got in thinking if they worked hard, it'd set them free, and really just made them starve faster. I mean, some twisted people, very twisted. All right, let's do one or two more. Moving on from here. Here you see a political cartoon that has to do with the French Revolution. So here it's supposed to represent America. It's being debased by these French radicals. I don't know who the guy on the hill is.
So is that what you were telling me about the short then?
What? I don't know. Liberty Cat? Okay.
Liberty Cap.
It's basically a sock hat or beanie. All right. Foreign Affairs Days Treaty. So Washington calls for neutrality, kept us out of the war, but England resented us for not supporting them. And you see, this is like the start of it. We try to stay out of things, but eventually get sucked in over and over and over again with these wars in Europe. Remember World War I, World War II? We tried out, but eventually got sucked in, though we were playing some games, before it all happened. So they believed we were helping France in secret. But the French thought the same thing. The English Navy proceeded to seize American boats that traded in the French Caribbean seas or islands. So we're like, well, a lot of our commerce has to do with trading with these islands. It's been like that ever since the early days of the colonies, trading things like sugarcane, molasses, rum, stuff like that. Also, the Canadians called for the Miamis, those are an Indian tribe, to fight Americans in Ohio. Twice they defeated our forces. So the British, who were in control of Canada, were having Native Americans attack a lot of our settlements and, of course, our militias. This caused many Americans to call for another war with England, and those who voiced their support for England often found themselves tarred and feathered. So you got to remember, these are the guys who lived through the American Revolution, and they believe, well, we already whooped England once, and now England's provoking war. So once again, things are heating up.
I wonder if they realized just how lucky we were to defeat England.
I think we did in 1812.
1812, we were more prepared, but the first revolution, we got just so insanely lucky.
Yeah, because most of the War of 1812 was terrible, unless you were Andrew Jackson. And then it was pretty good. Of course, he hated the British. Really, really hated the British.
Why?
Killed some of his family. He was a young teenager who fought the American Revolution. And after all of his buddies were killed, he was captured. and all the English did was beat him up because they just thought he was a little boy. Yeah, he hated them, never forgave them for humiliating him during the American Revolution.
Whoa.
It's like, I'm gonna get you back. Let's do one more, and we'll call it good for today.
So that was not chill.
All right, so I gotta fix this thing. All right, so last one. So Jay's Treaty, once again, slide 2. So in 1794, Washington sent Supreme Court Justice John Jay to England as a special envoy for peace. So we were trying to still figure out this whole diplomatic thing, but John Jay seemed like a pretty good position for this. Jay negotiated for Britain to leave the western forts, although they would still support Indian resistance. Remember, they were supposed to do that after the American Revolution. It was part of our treaty with them. Have some small trade agreements with the West Indies, and to pay a pre-war debts to England. Remember, we were supposed to do that too, except for losses regarding slavery. Jay hated slavery, so he wasn't going to help out those slaveholders. However, he said that it was okay for Britain to remove French property from French ships. Many felt that we had lost more than we gained in the treaty, and it was highly unpopular. So once again, it's going to be a division between American factions. You're going to have the Jeffersonians supported the French. The Hamiltonians, I guess you call them, support Britain. But Jay was trying to follow President Washington's orders to try to maintain neutrality and peace. So we're going to see, however, that despite this treaty, England isn't exactly going to respect our sovereignty, and neither is France. And so, when we come back on Wednesday, we're going to see that both of them, especially out in the open seas, are going to treat our ships as if they were the enemy, pretty much. Board them, attack them, sailors, stuff like that. So it's going to be a bit of a problem. So, all right, kids, that's going to end it for today. We will come back on Wednesday and see what happens next. Nobody knows.